In this episode of the Bur'yan podcast, we will talk about the Crimean Tatars, or Qirimli, who, along with the Crimean Karaites and Krymchaks, are one of the indigenous peoples of the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. Of course, one episode is not enough to reveal the complex history, culture, and struggles of Qirimli. Although the number of Crimean Tatar language media and publishing houses in Ukraine has increased in recent years, and discussions of the problems of the indigenous people of Ukraine are increasingly appearing in the mainstream media, international attention to this topic is still lacking. This episode's moderator is me, Elnara Nuriieva-Letova. I'm Crimean Tatar cross-media activist, author and publicist, and I'm also project manager of UA South and GMAT projects of Crimea media platform. Today we're going to discuss the history, culture, and identity of Qirimli to better understand the nature of repressions against Crimean Tatars in the occupied peninsula since 2014. After all, these repressions are not something new. They are part of Russia's violent colonization of Crimea, which has been going on for over 250 years. So our today's guest is Elmaz Alimova, who is Chevening Scholar, Master of Science student of Human Rights and Politics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Hi, Elmaz. Happy to have you here.
Hello, Elnara. Thank you for having me.
Elmaz, as a representative of indigenous peoples of Ukraine, as a Crimean Tatar, I think you are a very right person to talk about the process of formation of the Crimean Tatar people. Which cultures and ethnic groups influenced the formation of Crimean Tatars?
Thank you for this question, Elnara. It can be argued that Crimean Tatar nation is the oldest Turkic ethne in Europe, according to lots of prominent historians. And indeed, Crimea has a rich history. Crimean Tatars are a product, if we may say so, of a long process of cultural blending, of cultural ethnic synthesis. Crimea was always seen as a melting pot of nations, tribes, nomadic people who resided in Crimea. And its diverse influence of Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Turkic, Mongol, Ottoman, and Slavic people. And Crimean Tatar identity is truly unique, with a strong emphasis on its Turkic roots and Islamic faith. It cannot be claimed that someone more or less influenced the foundation of the nation. As I said, it's a unique mixture of all the cultures and ethnicities. And despite the monolithic nature of Crimean Tatar nation, today we see that it's divided into sub-ethnic groups. We have Yalyboylar, who are residing on a south coastal area of Crimea. We have Noghaylar, who reside on a steppe side. We have Tatlar, who reside on a foothill. So Crimean Tatar as a solid nation, which appeared as a consequence of this melting pot of different cultures and nations, came into being as a single solid Crimean Tatar nation that we know today in 15th, 16th century, as a result of extended assimilation processes of the old inhabitant of the peninsula.
My next question would be, why is it wrong to consider Crimean Tatars as a subgroup of Tatars?
It is, to my mind, very important to differentiate the very foundations of how Crimean Tatars appeared. It's a nation, it's an ethnic group which came into being on Crimean Peninsula due to various, very complex, multifaceted processes. And Crimean Tatars differed a lot from the populations, for instance, of Tatar Khanates of Kazan or Astrakhan. And Crimean Tatar identification has been laid in 15th, 16th century when the foundations of Crimean Khanate was developed, and when there was mass Islamization of peninsula, and when all these tribes and ethnicities were converting into Islam. And if we talk about why Crimean Tatars are not in any way a subgroup of Tatars, then we should take into consideration and look at several parts. It's how the nation was developed, what is the basics. It's Turkification and Islamization, which was unique in Crimea and played crucial role in forming Crimean Tatar as a solid nation. Greeks, Armenians, Goths, Huns, Kipchak Tatars blended and adopted Islam. Various groups contributed to the emergence of Crimean Tatar ethnic. If we look at the archives and works of historians, then we see that even in appearance, Crimean Tatars are very different from Volga Tatars, for instance, which also gives us understanding that these are completely different representatives of two different ethnic groups. If we look at cultural and national identities, we might also say that significantly Crimean Tatars in the 19th century was influenced by Ismail Gaspralı, who promoted the idea of ethno-linguistic nation. This identity was further developed by nationalists who emphasized that Crimean Peninsula as the homeland, as the Vatan for Crimean Tatars, which integrated this Western concept of sacredness of land to its indigenous people, Crimean Tatar, showcasing how the nation was born and how these ties and sense of belonging towards its land is very sacred and very important. So, summarizing, all these aspects are proving that Crimean Tatars are completely different ethnical group, which is very unique in its culture and has nothing to do and should never be mixed with the other ethnic groups such as Tatars.
Okay, so since you mentioned already Ismail Gaspralı, I would really like to discuss the history of the Crimean Tatar language and the literature. Influences of which cultures can be traced in the Crimean Tatar culture?
Thank you again. This is a very important question, because when we dig into what Crimean Tatars are, what they are about as a nation, we should understand that we cannot say that someone influenced more or less. This is the uniqueness of indigenous population, that we are a mixture, and I think that is of the whole range of different cultures and ethnicities. Our language, for instance, has undergone several changes throughout its history. Initially, our language was in Arabic script, and later it was replaced with Latin alphabet, if I'm not mistaken, in 1928, during a period of language reform in the Soviet Union. In 1938, it switched to Cyrillic script.
So it was just like less than 100 years ago that Crimean Tatars were still using Arabic script, and then for a short time, Crimean Tatars switched to using Latin and then Cyrillic in such a short amount of time.
Absolutely, and now there are attempts, to return the language to Latin script again, because the language is so unique in its sound and phonetics that Cyrillic alphabet does not reproduce and represent the whole range of uniqueness and beauty of the language. So it's being converted again to the Latin alphabet. And as I mentioned before, as there are three sub-ethnicities in Crimea, which is Yalıboylu, Noğaylar, and Tatlar, we have three different dialects also, which differ from region to region. When we talk about literature, we should mention that the beginning of Crimean Tatar literature dates back to 13th century, and the first prominent Crimean Tatar work being known, a poem, Yusuf and Zuleyha, by Mahmud Qirimli, which is the very foundation of our Crimean Tatar literature. Unfortunately, we don't have nowadays neither originals, no manuscripts of the copy of this poem, but we have copy of the copy, and it's very important archive, so we can turn back and see what is the beginning of our literature development. We can say that the blossom of our literature dates back to the period of Crimean Khanate, its so-called golden age of Crimean Tatar literature. It's 15th, 16th century. This century is characterized by a literature of divan, which was associated with the khans and the elites of Crimean Tatar rulers. Literature from that period is very complex. It was written in a very difficult language, which was not spoken by common people. This period of golden age didn't last long, because then first annexation happened in 1783, and this was the beginning of dissolution of Crimean Khanate and decline of the development of Crimean Tatar rich culture in all these aspects, language, literature and everything. And this period is associated as Kara Devur, meaning dark era, black era of Crimean Tatar culture development.
So what was further development of the Crimean Tatar language and literature when Russia came over and annexed Crimea for the first time?
As I said, it was the worst period of stagnation of Crimean Tatar language and development. And we might claim that the literary revival began with the emergence of Ismail Kasprinsky. He's considered like a founding father of Crimean Tatar nation, literary and language realm. It's the end of 18th, beginning of 19th centuries. Before him, I would say there was almost no artistic prose in Crimean Tatar literature, because mostly they were letters, poetry, primarily historical and religious treatises. And his followers, writers such as Shref Shemizadeh, Bekir Chobanzadeh, who is actually from my hometown, from Karasuk Bazar, Shamil Aladin, Yusuf Bulat, they began to develop Crimean Tatar literature into what it is known as today. So if we talk about Ashraf Shamilzadeh, Bekir Chobanzadeh, Shamil Aladin, we know them as renowned poets of Crimean Tatar nation who made significant contributions to Crimean Tatar literature. For instance, Ashraf Shamilzadeh, he is known for his evocative poetry, which often reflects the struggles and nonviolent resistance of Crimean Tatar people. His works explore themes of identity, displacement, resilience. If we talk about Bekir Chobanzadeh, he is one of the most renowned poets and scholars, and his works encompass a wide range of themes about love, about nature, social issues reflecting events happening at his period. His poetry is full of philosophical insights. Shamil Aladin, for example, he is both contributor into prose and poetry and captured in his works everyday life and struggles of Crimean Tatars. And in particular, his works reflect commitment in preserving Crimean Tatar culture and history.
Could you please name the most famous, influential works of these authors?
Shamil Aladin was the main editor of Crimean Tatar journal Yıldız. He has touching poetry, Tan Bulbulü, Toprak Kuldu, Kok Kuldu, very deep envisioning of his homeland, of belonging to your native place. Bekir Chobanzadeh, who is from my hometown, Karasuk Bazar, was another prominent poet and professor of Turkish languages, extremely talented person, and was one of the victims of Great Soviet Purge when actually our intelligentsia was exterminated. He was arrested by Soviets in the age of 44, so we see that his life was rather short, and he was sentenced to death. So, coming back to a point of our literature development, our prominent poets and writers in their work, of course, reflected the reality of the difficult Soviet times, of the hardships that the whole nation was undergoing, and of course it had impact on the literature in general. After deportation in 1944, in exile, there were still attempts to write and be focused on the themes of loss, of longing to come back, to return to homeland, struggle for preserving the identity. And the literature in exile is marked by poignant reflection of the hardships and resilience, again, that Crimean Tatars showed.
If we talk about an overall current situation of the Crimean Tatar language and literature, I would say the situation is rather dire and our language is being on a decline. It's being defined by UNESCO as an endangered language, which is meant that it's being on the brink of its extinction. And of course, there should be more proactive initiatives and support on a higher political levels to do whatever it takes, not only to preserve our language, but to make favorable conditions for its further development, so we don't lose our language as a language of indigenous population. There are different brilliant initiatives supporting the development of Crimean Tatar literature. One of such projects, for instance, is Crimean Fig, which is trying to revive the unique Crimean Tatar poetry, stories, translate them into Ukrainian, and showcase how undervalued our Crimean Tatar literature is, which is also a unique part of a bigger Ukrainian literature. And through these literary pieces of work, we should show what Crimean Tatars are about, what is at the core of our identity, what our resistance is about. And we, of course, should make it a part of a wider Ukrainian literary context. And we should in no case let our literature and our unique language die out.
What I wanted to say is that I really love the kind of new initiatives of having those online short YouTube or Instagram lessons. They are mostly for Ukrainian audience, and they are actually pretty successful. I really love this initiative, and I myself follow and learn something new because unfortunately, even though I am Crimean Tatar by ethnicity, the level of my Crimean Tatar language is terrible. I cannot even communicate basic things. Like I can maintain a very, very small talk, but that's gonna be it. So the language is severely endangered, and I can only confirm that.
Absolutely, I would agree because I have two boys growing and it's extremely hard for us. I guess that my knowledge of Crimean Tatar language is average, I would say. I can't communicate with my kids and talk because it's a principal issue for me, for them to know the language. And I try to speak, but it's very limited, I would say. I really like this initiative of our friends. It's a multimedia project called Bulbul, which is very nice and picturesque. There's cartoons and videos in Crimean Tatar. But what my point is that it should be brought on a wider governmental level because these singular, I would say, initiatives are good, but it is not obviously enough for the language to survive and to develop. I know that there are some laws being adopted by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine supporting the language. So basically they kind of encourage people to contribute to the Crimean Tatar language development and popularization. But this initiative should be getting bigger. It should be like a systematical policy of the government of our country to support and not to lead to irreversible consequences when the language is not there and we just lose it.
Definitely. But on the other hand, Ukraine has so much more things to worry about currently because it's also now a matter of surviving as Ukrainians as well. So don't get me wrong, I can totally understand your point, but on the other hand, I think, yeah, but when there is like a matter of survival, it's kind of tricky. Anyways, that's just my personal comment.
Yeah, sure, I agree.
Could you please share your personal experience on how your Crimean Tatar identity was formed during your childhood in your family and in your community? How did you feel that you are Crimean Tatar and how it is different from others?
Oh, Elnara, thank you for this question. It's a very tricky one, I would say, because the acceptance of my identity was not an easy task. I remember myself in my school years when actually I was really frightened to confess or say someone that I am Crimean Tatar because I didn't want to be bullied on the national ground. And when you are a child in like you're 12, 13 years old, it's very difficult for you to understand whether it's true or not when your group mate or classmates call that you are a traitor.
The Soviet Union accused Crimean Tatars of collaborating with the Nazi regime during World War II, announced them as traitors of the Soviet motherland, and used that as a ground for the so-called deportation, which in fact was an ethnic cleansing. Early in the morning, on 18th May 1944, all the Crimean Tatars were taken from their homes. Children, women, men who didn't serve in the army, and elderly people were all put into cattle cars and spent days or even weeks on the road by rail in packed train cars in hunger and unsanitary conditions. Thousands of people died during the deportation and many more during the first years in the new settlements, basically camps. According to the estimates, Crimean Tatars lost around 46% of the population. The total number of Crimean Tatar people deported was 191,044. Most of the Soviet Union population was massively brainwashed and truly believed that all the Crimean Tatars deserved that, and moreover, that Stalin actually saved them and spared their lives by sending them somewhere else instead of killing them all. For decades, Crimean Tatars have been called traitors, no matter if they ever even saw a German soldier. There are already many generations born after World War II, but there are still people who will not deny themselves the pleasure and call any Crimean Tatar they have problem with a traitor. Crimean Tatars were deported along with other 9 nationalities in the USSR: Koreans, Germans, Finns, Karaites, Kalmyks, Chechens, Ingush, and Meskhetian Turks. In 1956, 3 years after Stalin's death, all of these nations were allowed to leave their special settlements for their homeland, all of them, apart from Crimean Tatars, who weren't allowed to live in Crimea up until the Soviet Union collapsed.
So it was difficult for me, and I guess things started to get better when I entered the university, and it was Crimean Engineering and Pedagogical University in Simferopol, which is the only Crimean Tatar university in Crimea, and things started to change. I started to understand that it's kind of a safe place where I can admit that I'm a Crimean Tatar and I'm kind of surrounded by peers the same ethnicity.
Sorry to interrupt. So you grew up in Karasu-Bazar, in Stary Krim?
Yes, in Karasu-Bazar, in Bilogorsk. Yes, it's Bilogirsk, yes.
Bilogorsk, how Russians called it. And yet, like from what I know, Bakhchisarai and Bilogirsk or Karasu-Bazar in Crimean Tatar, 2 cities, or towns, I'd say, in Crimea that are mostly populated by Crimean Tatars, up to 50%. And still, you felt unsafe there to say that you're Crimean Tatar. This is mind-blowing.
Absolutely, yes. And more than that, I attended kind of mainly pro-Russian school. It was Academy of Sholkin someone, like, you know. It's very interesting because there were not that many Crimean Tatars even in my class. So it was majority of Ukrainians, I would say, Russians in my class. As you mentioned, Karasu-Bazar is like kind of mostly pro-Crimean Tatar. Crimean Tatar city is one of the most. You know, as a child, it would be easier for me just to avoid this conversation. And I remember that even like when someone was asking my name and I said it's Elmaz, I was asked, but so you're a Crimean Tatar. They said, but you don't look like Crimean Tatar, which was the positive response. And it was like, I was very, very like shocked and perplexed. How should I react? Should I be like happy? Oh, okay, so no one will bully me because of my appearance or something. So it was very difficult. But as I said, things started to get better during my university years. Acceptance of my identity came probably closer to 2014, before the annexation in 2014, when I just realized that I'm Crimean Tatar. I take Ukrainian stance, and that's the only way. And of course, coming to current reality, I'm proud, and whoever I meet whenever abroad, I tell that I'm a Ukrainian, but I'm a Crimean Tatar by origin.
Yeah, I also say I'm Ukrainian, Crimean Tatar, because it is important for me to show my ethnic identity, ethnic origins, and it's also important for me to show which state I belong to. Because if you say Crimean Tatars, people, most of the time, they don't even know where Crimea is. I grew up in Bakhchisarai, and I lived and grew up in the area which is still called compact
compact residing areas.
Residing of Crimean Tatars, and I was surrounded by Crimean Tatars. So the first time I faced discrimination was in my first grade, because I also went to mostly Russian populated school, and we were like 3 to 5 Crimean Tatars in our class, and my neighbor was Russian, and once I asked him for rubber, I think, and he was like, my mom told me that Crimean Tatars are traitors. I'm not gonna give you anything. And I was quite shocked, and it's for the first time I heard something like that, because again, I grew up among Crimean Tatars and I never knew this. And I asked my mom what was it about, and she told me that she actually had to face that since her like 3-4 years, because she grew up first in Ural for a little bit and then in Tajikistan, and she said that there was always a drunken neighbor who was screaming and yelling at children, saying that all the Crimean Tatars, their children need to be killed, need to be dead, and all of that. So I was kind of lucky, I guess, because I didn't face all those things. And what I mentioned was probably the first time when I started thinking about my own identity and the area where I grew up, and then where I went to school. It was 2 different worlds. And then I was just probably lucky to have more and more Crimean Tatars in my class. But it is interesting that so there are a lot of Crimean Tatars, and you would think that Russian-speaking population would be more like, oh, they are actually good people and they will be less against or less scared. But it was getting radicalized, and all of my former classmates, they are biggest fans of Russia currently. And for me, this is just mind-blowing.
Absolutely. I feel really sorry. And, this is how propaganda worked for years, and how deeply traumatized we were actually growing, not understanding who you are, whether you're a good person. Because when you hear all of this, your naive brain do believe this. I mean, what your group mates say. When, okay, you are Crimean Tatar, I will not share this rubber with you. What you should think. You still cannot critically overlook and make some analysis that probably what he is saying, it's not true. You're taking it as a true, and then you are kind of lost, and you grow with this absolutely lost kind of identity, and then at some point you need to regain it. And it's a very difficult path towards accepting who you are, and not just accepting, but being proud. For me, it took a long years.
I was probably lucky because I felt the support, the backup, even though I was the first to trash talk Crimean Tatars when it came to, women's rights, for example. A girl is supposed to be this and this. A girl is supposed to do this and this. A girl is supposed to behave. So I was the first to say how much I dislike what I heard. But on the other hand, in Bakhchisarai at least, I never felt unsafe. And later, actually, I felt more and more proud of being Crimean Tatar. And in 2014, it crystallized even more when I moved to Kiev. I finally learned our national anthem. It happened there. I decided that I want to deepen my Crimean Tatar knowledge. It's just interesting how being supported by community helped me feel safe, at least from this perspective of I was never afraid to say that I'm Crimean Tatar and so on.
And as you said, someone is more lucky or less lucky depending on the region where you live. But anyway, all of us probably have some stark experiences on these ethnic grounds. So, but it's the part of our way and of understanding who you are, even though sometimes it was not that pleasant.
Yeah. What I remember also is my granny being against me befriending Russian children and bringing them home. She was always getting super mad and telling me you cannot trust them, you should not bring them home. And I never understood that. And she told me early on about deportation and all of that, but I was always thinking, oh, it's already in the past. They are grandchildren of those people who did it. And she was still no, they have it in their blood. You cannot trust them. Well, apparently, and unfortunately, she was kind of right.
Yeah, indeed.
So now, let's dive deep into the history of Crimean Tatars and the Crimean Peninsula itself, big part of which is history of colonization of Crimea by the Russian Empire and genocide of Crimean Tatars. Our guest speaker is Martin-Oleksand Kisly, who is a Ukrainian historian of Crimea and Crimean Tatars with a focus on Soviet and post-Soviet periods. In 2021, he defended a PhD dissertation entitled Crimean Tatars Return to the Homeland in 1956-1989. When we speak about Crimean Tatar statehood, the first thing that comes to mind is the Crimean Khanate. Martin, could you please elaborate on how it was founded and which circumstances influenced the emergence of the state?
Unfortunately, it's too complicated to put it in a short manner because there are many context issues that should be mentioned while talking about the history of Crimea and about the topic of how Crimean Khanate emerged. But what I can put generally is that for centuries, the south of Ukraine, the so-called steppe civilizations, there were many nomadic tribes, nomadic communities who were living there, who were having their statehood there. All of us remember for sure story about Scythians and ancient Greeks, and the whole story of the south of Crimea and the Crimean Peninsula as well as a place where the steppe civilization was present is a very long story. And probably it can be said that the emergence of Crimean Khanate was a high point of this long process of nomadic tribes being at this place for centuries. So by the middle of 14th century, there were Kipchak Turkic-speaking Tatar nomads who were living in the steppe, in this region. They completed their ethnogenesis and they formed ethnical community. A Tatar Khanate, it was ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan. Crimean Khanate is a statehood. It was formed after the Mongol Empire collapsed. It's a very simplest way to explain it.
Yeah, I can totally understand that this question alone requires hours of conversations. My question is that how long did it exist and what was the form of political governance?
It existed for more than 3 centuries, and the political governance was typical for steppe statehoods. So there was a Khan as a head of the state, but next to him was kind of a council of those who we are calling beys, the Tatars nobility of the time. And for us Ukrainians, this model of a statehood is very familiar because we know it for sure from Kazakhstan. The Kazakh Rada, the Kazakh Council, was absolutely the same pattern of governance, when there was a head who was elected in some very traditional manner, but the governance was by the council.
Since you mentioned already Kazakhs, I would really love to ask you what relationships did Crimean Khanate have with neighbors, not only Kazakhs, but others included?
There are many dimensions of what we can call relations. So if we are talking in a very stereotypical way about some local wars, European wars, about struggle for the land, the relations between Crimean Tatars and Kazakhs were not so good. But at the same time, we are talking in the cultural dimension or even about some linguistical interceptions between communities. We can say that both of them got many common features in how they were dressing up, how they were acting, how they were fighting, how many Ukrainian words were influenced by Turkic language. The steppe, the south part of Ukrainian territory, it was always a crossroad of different cultures, and in the early modern period, Crimean Tatars and Kazakhs, it was probably 2 major forces in the region who had many connections on this crossroad of civilizations and cultures.
Basically, with the first annexation of Crimea, the Crimean Khanate started falling. Could you please elaborate what was happening during those times in 1783-84 under the rule of Catherine, and also share more details on the military suppression of the Crimean Tatar uprisings?
Traditionally, we are starting the history of colonization of Crimea as you said, from 1783, from the period of time when Crimean Khanate was occupied or annexed by Russian Empire. At the same time, it should be mentioned that it's more accurate to say that this process, it started earlier in time, because in 1774, when so-called Kuchuk-Kainarja peace treaty was signed between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, because according to the treaty, Crimean Khanate became an independent state, but at the same time, the Russian influence on the Crimean Tatar state was at this high point. The last Crimean Tatars Khan, Shahin Giray, he was influenced in so many ways by Russian Empire that it made possible the Russian occupation of Crimea in 1783. Why it took so long for Russian Empire to annex Crimea, to occupy Crimea? Almost 10 years, 9 years actually. Probably it was the issue which you already raised. Russians were afraid of uprisings, which possibly may arise in the case that Russia will come to Crimea with their big army. So for 9 years they were accumulating military forces in Crimea. Of course, the local population was not happy with these new circumstances that they now were under the Russian war, under the Russian protection. What happened in Kuchuk-Kainarja and what was involving Crimea in 1774 was something that we can call a hybrid occupation. Of course, the Russian annexation of Crimea, it was a tragedy for local population in many dimensions. First, probably we need to start with how it was declared. According to the manifesto by Catherine II, the local population, the Crimean Tatars, they were seen like uncivilized, so uncivilized that they cannot even be able to govern themselves. So for this reason, according to the manifesto, the Crimea was annexed to the Russian Empire, because some more civilized force were coming to help some barbarians to govern the land. Different laws were introduced in Crimea after the arrival of the Russian Empire. First of all, land ownership laws, they were extremely different in the Russian Empire than in Crimea. So many Crimean Tatars were deprived of their pieces of land. Secondly, of course, the religious issue, despite the fact that according to the manifesto of Catherine II, the Crimean Tatars it was said that they will have all their liberties in practicing their faith, but it wasn't true. They were discriminated in many ways. Moreover, the Russian authorities, they were looking at the local mullahs as agents of Ottoman Empire. Of course, there are always some kind of agents in Russia.
True that.
They discriminated not only mullahs, but all the Crimean Tatars who were visiting mullahs and who were practicing Islam. So in the 19th century, a very massive, semi-forced migration of Crimean Tatars out of Crimea started. First of all, to Ottoman Empire, Turkey, Dobruja, what is today Romania. And by the end of 19th century, Crimean Tatars became the national minority on their own land.
Yeah. But how was this so-called forced, silent deportation carried out? What tools did the Russian Empire use for this purpose? Very easily. Those peasants who were deprived of their land, they had no resources to survive, and for this reason they were leaving the Crimea. And the biggest reason were religion discrimination of the local population. And we should remember that in the 19th century, the religion identity were much more stronger than the national identity. So for them, going somewhere where their religion is approved, it was more possible than staying in Crimea, despite the fact that Crimea was their homeland. To be honest, the whole notion of the homeland, it arose much more later, but it's another question to discuss. I can actually give a good example. My great-grandfather's brother, he immigrated to Turkey specifically for this reason, because he was very religious and he wanted to continue doing all the rituals which Islam requires. And since it was getting harder and harder, just like now in Crimea, actually, him and his family, they escaped to Turkey. And my own great-grandfather, when they were already in Tajikistan, they were closing the doors when they were doing a namaz and they were praying. And they also didn't have this crazy longing to go back to Crimea. They were saying, oh, no, it's so bad there. Let's stay here because we can actually pray. We are not starving here because in Crimea there is starvation. It's so bad. And it's interesting that it's basically a generation of my grandmother who were already so strong about going back to Crimea. This is just like my comment.
But it's very relevant. Just yesterday we had a kind of a closed meeting with some experts in Crimean issues, and we were talking about that what we can see in Crimea since 2014 is actually a process of recolonization of the peninsula. And to be honest, Russia is using the same practices it was using in the 19th century, in the end of the 18th century. For instance, if you are talking about all these so-called Putin's friends, Berlusconi and other politicians, not only politicians, but popular figures, artists, musicians, all those who are visiting Crimea to legitimize the annexation of Crimea. The same practice was used by Catherine in the end of the 18th century, when she visited Crimea for it was her first visit. It was very important visit, and we know about it from history, about this Potemkin's village, which according to the legend were built along her way to the peninsula. To this trip and to this visit of Crimea, many European diplomats and public figures were invited to legitimize this annexation, to show who is the actual ruler of this land. The same with semi-forced migration or semi-forced deportation, or what you call hybrid deportation. You use this term just because today we are calling it the hybrid deportation, because the most active, those who cannot be silent in the circumstances of occupation, they are just pushed out of Crimea in different ways. Some of them are living all by themselves, some living to jails somewhere in Siberia and Ural.
So basically the tools Russia is using to colonize Crimea have not changed that much since the 18th century.
Why Crimean Tatars became the minority in their own land by the end of 19th century? Not only because of the semi-forced migration, but because Russian Empire were bringing many, just so many settlers to Crimea. By the way, not only settlers from the Russian Empire, but settlers from European countries. All those who were writing their story about this fascinating land with beautiful mountains and a warm sea. The same thing is going on just right now. Nobody can say an actual number, but we can talk about 1 million settlers who came to Crimea since 2014.
I would also like to mention that Russia was recruiting Crimean Tatars in the army, and Russia is trying to do this now as well, and that's what it's doing. So when I came across a song that is called Port Artur, I was quite surprised. I googled that Port Artur is somewhere, was it China? And I could not see any connection between Crimean Tatars and China and old Crimean Tatar mothers singing the song, but it was basically about Crimean Tatar youngsters getting recruited in the Russian army and being sent 5,000 kilometers away to die. So, and yeah, unfortunately, Russia is doing that today as well by recruiting young Crimean Tatars into their army to fight against Ukraine. When we talk about Crimean Khanate, it at least somewhat known and people can relate to, okay, there was Khan and there was probably Khanate, but this is something in Crimean history that only specialists basically know, and Crimean Tatar population as well. So this is Crimean People's Republic, Qirimli. It is basically the first Turkic and Muslim democratic republic in the world. Could you please tell us more about its formation and its political culture as well?
It's something that was expected to happen somewhere in a time, because as I said previously, by the beginning of the 20th century, the national identity started to prevail over the religious one. To be honest, it was the common process for this part of the world. Somewhere it started earlier, somewhere it started lately. We know a lot from Ukrainian history, from the Eastern European history, about local elites, intelligentsia, who were looking for the roots of their national identity in the traditional culture, in the local language, in the way how people are attached to the land. And due to Ismail Gasprinsky, who forged and shaped not only new methods of learning for Crimean Tatar kids, not only established and was publishing for many years a newspaper which was spread all over Turkic world, but around him a community of new Crimean Tatar elite emerged. Of course, there was some kind of a conflict between Gasprinsky, who was more conservative and he was, let us say, be more outdated in his political thoughts, and those youngsters who were much more radical. By some points of time, many of them visited Turkey to attain some education. At this period of time, there was such phenomena in Turkey, in Ottoman Empire, as a Young Turks movement. And probably they liked it all because it was very close to what Crimean Tatars were looking for their identity. And it was accumulating as ideas, as notions, as understanding. It was accumulating for many years. What happened in Russian Empire in 1917, the so-called revolutionary period, it made possible all those ideas of anti-colonial struggle, of nation building, of recovering the Crimean Khanate as a state, because the memory about the state ruined by the Russian Empire, it was alive. The Crimean Khanate was imagined as a golden cradle of Crimean Tatar people. It almost typical story of how different nation state emerged during the revolutionary period in this part of the world, yeah? But there are some very unique features of the state of Crimean Tatar Republic. First of all, it was built on principles of democracy, liberation, anti-colonial struggle, and probably the most important, emancipation. And this emancipation principle was total in its manner. It was not only about electional rights. It was about workers, about females, about different ethnic minorities who were settling in Crimea at the time. Unfortunately, it was existing just for a month, a little bit more, maybe 2 months, because of the Bolsheviks who came to Crimea. A very bright, but at the same time very short and very sad story. From the other hand, the very same fact that Crimean Tatars succeeded to reinstall, to recreate, to declare their own national state during the revolutionary period, it's giving us a notion about how deep is their potential for statehood.
So, what was happening in Crimea under the Soviet occupation?
It started with the Red Terror. Bolsheviks started their rule in Crimea with the Red Terror, with punishing all those who, according to their view, were against the Red Revolution. And of course, local population who participated in Kurultai, who participated in many local initiatives, they were under attack. Of course, the religious community were under the attack, all the mullahs. All of them were called counter-revolutionaries and many of them were killed. The approximate number is like 100,000, probably it can be said. But it was not the only sad event which marked the start of the Soviet rule in Crimea. In 1921, man-made famine started in Crimea. There were some natural reasons why it may started, but due to local authorities who were taking out the food, all the grains from the local peasants, it turned into the famine. It was so drastic that even some kind of American volunteer organization were sending food to help Crimean peasants at the time. Due to many reasons, and this was a common practice over the Soviet Union, it was called colonization, rooted in. The same policy was introduced in Crimea. It was called Tatarization. What did it mean? It was about bringing up local elites who were loyal to the Soviet authorities to govern in Crimea, so to give the power to indigenous people. It was a part of a Soviet project of emancipation. It was really good because the education in local Crimean schools, it was in Crimean Tatars language. The Crimean Tatars language became the second state language of the Crimean Republic. Many books were published in Crimean Tatars language. Scientific ethnographic research started. A Crimean Tatar theater was established. Many newspapers were published at the time. But of course it had an end, and the end was very sad because many of those who became bright and prominent and important, who paved a way for a new generation of Crimean Tatars, intelligence of Crimean Tatars, they were killed. Some of them were killed in the end of 20s, the rest of them were killed in 1938 during the so-called Stalin's Great Terror. So literally Crimea was flooded in blood, and coming closer to the Second World War, Crimean Tatar, they were extremely weak. The peasantry were weak because of the Soviet collectivization policy, because they didn't have any piece of land at the time. They were forced to join kolkhozes. Most of the intelligentsia of cultural, political, academia elite, they were just killed, literally. This very short period of time when Crimean Tatars felt themselves like a masters in their own land due to this very weird Soviet emancipation policy. It was a very, very short period, unfortunately.
Yes, and then the deportation of Crimean Tatars followed that basically left 0 Crimean Tatars on the peninsula. And I'd like to discuss how was the deportation of Crimean Tatars carried out.
It started right after the liberation of Crimea from German army in the spring of 1944 and was carried by NKVD troops early in the morning at the dawn of May 18. They were just coming to the people's house, knocking at the door without a reasonable explanation and giving just 10 or 15 minutes to collect all the stuff and be ready to leave, to live where. And people were scared, they were shocked, and they didn't understand what's going on actually. And most of them were not speaking Russian language. So if even the NKVD officer tried to explain where they are going, none of them were able to understand it. Many of them were traumatized by the way how Germans were killing Jews and Karaites in Crimea during the occupation. So they were expecting something similar. Many of them left their households without carrying any food or any warm clothes, any belongings which may be useful in their exile. According to the statement made by Stalin, they had like 10 days or 2 weeks for deportation. But as it was usually be done in Soviet Union, they overfulfilled the plan and they deported all the population in 3 days. According to the official document, the final destination was Uzbekistan, but while on the way, some of the trains with deportees were sent to Ural, 5,000 of Crimean Tatars were sent to Kazakhstan, but majority ended in Uzbekistan. So if we account those who were deported in the May of 1944, if we account Crimean Tatars men at the time of deportation still fighting in Red Army, they were able to join their families after the end of the war. If you are counting those whom Germans sent to Germany during the occupation for forced labor, Astarbeiter, from Crimea, and there were many Crimean Tatars among them. If you are counting all of those Crimean Tatars who by the end of the war ended in exile, it is more than 200,000, 207,000. Crimean Tatars were deprived of their land.
My grandparents are actually, they belong to this little percentage who ended up in Ural, and they could not leave those camps up until Stalin died, and then they moved to Tajikistan because it's simply better weather conditions. So, okay, so the word deportation itself, I only recently realized how wrong it is, because deport is when you are visiting some country and you are breaking the immigration law or whatever, and you were being deported therefore. What do you think about that? So is it still right to call it deportation, or we should stick to genocide? What are your thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right. When I was writing my thesis, The Deportation Return, I was trying to look for some literature for some similar cases in the history of other places and other nations. And when I was trying to use this keyword deportation, there was just nothing what can be similar to the case of Crimean Tatars, because the very use of this word is absolutely different from what we are having in the case of 1944 deportation of Crimean Tatars. So I may easily agree that it's not a proper wording here and it can be called something different. But at the same time, there is still a old generation of those who actually were deported and who managed to return to Crimea. Not many, but they are still among us. And of course, it's a kind of a trauma, but even when they are talking about the exile period, they are saying it in the wrong manner according to the rule of the language, but they're saying in deportation, like we were living in deportation. They are not saying we were living in exile. They are still saying we were living in deportation. Or, I don't know, my younger son was born in deportation. So this word is so deeply rooted into the collective memory of the community. So I don't know actually how it can be uprooted. Probably one of the possible ways in a long-term manner is using of a native language for Crimean Tatars, in which the deportation will be not a proper word to use.
You are listening to Bur'yan podcast. Our guests today were Elmaz Alimova and Martin-Oleksand Kisly. And moderating was me, Elnara Nuriieva-Letova. In the second part of this episode, we will talk about the events and struggles of Qirimli after the deportation, their return to Crimea, and the current situation on the occupied peninsula. If you want to reach us and share your thoughts on the episode, please email us at bidamedia@proton.me. Thank you so much.